Whatever the challenges abroad, Kennedy knew America faced real and mounting problems at home. Despite his growth in office, the limitations of his influence were never more clearly seen than in his handling of the greatest domestic crisis of his presidency, the battle over civil rights. On June 11, 1963, he went further than any of his predecessors in denouncing racial bigotry.
This nation was founded by men of many nations and backgrounds. It was founded on the principle that all men are created equal. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place?
The words spoke of a moral imperative, and they moved a nation. But it was June 1963. Many who heard the call and were uplifted by the sentiment were left to ask why it had taken so long.
Kennedy's legacy is artificial memory. Artificial memory that he was more committed to civil rights than he actually was, an artificial memory that says he was a greater champion of justice than he actually was. And it's difficult sometimes, even for those of us who lived through it, to separate the artificial from the real. In the real, he simply was not as committed to civil rights as he pretended to be, as his handlers, as his romanticizers have made him appear to be. He simply wasn't.
Kennedy's supporters insist the president's commitment was real. So what was the record of those 1,000 days? Many, like John Lewis, felt that Kennedy had been elected without understanding the insidious nature of segregation.
He knew very little, if anything, about the American South. We had to create the climate, the environment, to get President Kennedy and others in the administration to move, to act.
You're through with your prayers and you're through with your disturbance here.
Dad, I know you ain't a master. I know you made us all and
For 2 years, Kennedy would refuse to act. For 2 years, he would find himself a spectator as black activists seized the initiative and confronted the evils of segregation head-on. The pressure on John Kennedy was applied early into his presidency. On May 4th, 1961, John Lewis was among a group called the Freedom Riders, who boarded Greyhound buses for a journey into the Deep South. They intended to travel from Washington to New Orleans to expose institutionalized segregation.
Nothing, but nothing would stop us. We didn't know whether we would be beaten, whether we would be shot and killed, but we were prepared to complete the Freedom Ride.
The president and his attorney general were skeptical. They feared a white backlash that would sink the administration's domestic program. They wanted to fight for equal justice, but in the courts, not on the streets. John Kennedy told his staff to get the civil rights activists off the buses.
The last thing in the world that he wanted was a lot of violence, because he didn't know what to do about it.
On the morning of May 15th, when the buses crossed into Alabama from Georgia along Highway 78, they approached the town of Anniston. At that point, white mobs surrounded one of the buses and set it on fire. No one was killed, but it was a warning of what was to come. The remaining buses continued through Alabama, and on Saturday, May 20th, the Freedom Riders reached Montgomery.
And the very moment that we started descending from the bus down those steps, you saw a group of people just coming out of nowhere with baseball bats, clubs, rocks, chains, pipes, anything they could use for a weapon. I was hit in the head with a wooden crate and knocked down and left bloody and unconscious. I thought I was going to die.
Kennedy denounced the violence, but did not endorse the campaign. Polls showed that nearly 2/3 of Americans disapproved of the Freedom Riders' tactics. The president did persuade the governor of Alabama to provide protection for the buses until they arrived at the Mississippi state line. That was where Kennedy's influence ended. The Mississippi State Police immediately arrested the protesters and hauled them off to jail.
I knew Alabama was bad, but Mississippi, we were told over and over again, was worse. I remember when we literally arrived at the gates to Parchman State Penitentiary. We arrived there, and this guard said, "Sing your goddamn freedom songs now. We have niggers here to beat you up or eat you up. Sing your goddamn freedom songs now." We walk into this unbelievable long hallway, and the guard said, "Take off all your clothes." I think it was an attempt to dehumanize us. It was probably one of the most eerie and one of the most frightening moments during the Freedom Ride.
Lewis and the other Freedom Riders would spend over 3 weeks inside a Mississippi prison. But Kennedy was still reluctant to embrace their cause and challenge Southern senators who controlled his whole legislative agenda. While Kennedy wavered, the movement selected its next target, Ole Miss, the bastion of Southern segregation.
Mississippi, the state, is the quintessential Southern state. It is the most resistant of all of the Southern states, and Ole Miss is its flagship university. If segregation can be broached there, then of course it'll be easy everywhere.
Again, the civil rights movement was moving ahead of the Kennedy administration. The president knew that any attempt to desegregate Ole Miss would end in violence, and that he would be left picking up the pieces. That didn't concern James Meredith. In September 1962, he gained admission to Ole Miss, but after arriving on the campus in Oxford, his registration was blocked by the state's governor, Ross Barnett. Governor Barnett called Washington and told the Attorney General that the law of Mississippi didn't allow for the integration of the state university. What he didn't know was that Jack Kennedy had placed a recording device across his line. 40 years later, those recordings are part of the record of the Kennedy years.
And General, how can I violate my oath of office? How can I do that and live with the people of Mississippi? That's what I'm up against, and I don't understand why the court wouldn't understand that.
Governor, this is the president speaking.
Yes, sir.
Now, I know that your feeling about the law of Mississippi, and what we really want to have from you, though, is some understanding about whether the state police will maintain law and order. But what we're concerned about is how much violence is going to be and what kind of action we'll have to take to prevent it. And now, how good is...
You have 220 highway patrolmen.
Right.
And they'll absolutely be unarmed.
Well, what can they do to maintain law and order and prevent the gathering of a mob and action taken by the mob? What can they do? Can they stop that? Can you maintain this order?
Well, I don't know. That's what I'm worried about. You see, I don't know whether I can or not. I just don't understand the situation down here.
Kennedy was convinced that without federal protection, Meredith would be murdered. He obtained a federal court ruling demanding that the state of Mississippi allow Meredith to register. In a desperate appeal for calm, Kennedy went before the nation at 10 o'clock on the evening of September 30th and called for all sides to respect the rule of law.
Americans are free and sure to disagree with the law, but not to disobey it. For in a government of laws and not of men, no man, however prominent or powerful, and no mob, however unruly or boisterous, is entitled to defy a court of law.
Kennedy's address took place as a cloud of tear gas rose over the campus. Deputy Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach had been sent to take charge. He arrived just as the shooting began.
It turned into a real riot, and we used tear gas. As soon as they started shooting real live bullets at us, I thought there was no way we could control that riot without massive force. And so I did ask for the troops.
But the deployment of federal troops was exactly what Kennedy had wanted to avoid. The next day, Ross Barnett called the White House with a suggestion.
I'll tell you what I'll do, Mr. President.
Yeah.
I'll go up there myself.
Well, now, how long will it take you to get there?
And I'll get a microphone and tell them that you have agreed to be removed.
Now, wait a minute. Wait a minute, Governor. Now, how long is it going to take you to get up there?
About an hour.
Now, I tell you what, if you want to go up there, then you call me from up there, and then we'll decide what we're going to do before you make any speeches about it.
This man has just died.
Did he die?
Yes.
Which one? State police?
That's state police.
Yeah. Well, you see, we got to get order up there, and that's what we thought we were going to have.
President, please, why don't you, can't you give an order up there to remove me?
How can I remove him, Governor, when there's a riot in the street, and he may step out of that building and something happen to him? I can't remove him under those conditions. Well, we've got to get somebody up there now to get order and stop the firing and the shooting. And then you and I'll talk about what's the best thing to do with Merida.
All right, then.
Thank you.
All right.
Reluctantly, the federal troops were sent in. The presence of 23,000 soldiers, 3 times the population of Oxford, did quell the violence. James Meredith was admitted to the university. But the personal and political price on Kennedy had been high. Polls taken at the time showed how divided the country was becoming. In the North, Kennedy's numbers rose sharply, but in the South, they dropped like a rock. Kennedy was in no mood for a protracted fight over a civil rights bill. Among movement leaders, Kennedy's refusal to send up legislation was seen as evidence that he lacked political courage. In April 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King announced the movement was returning to the streets, back to where the Freedom Ride had encountered the full measure of Southern resistance, back to Birmingham, Alabama.
It was easy to demonize Birmingham. Birmingham was the most segregated city in the United States. It had this horrific police commissioner, Bull Connor. It had this long, long reputation for violence against blacks and against others. And it was an easy place to say, we're picking this because it's the worst of the worst.
On April 3, 1963, Martin Luther King began the Birmingham campaign. The aim was to desegregate the city by sit-ins, economic boycotts, and mass marches. Stores were to be emptied and jails filled. But after a month, the campaign was going nowhere. Press interest had vanished, and Dr. King had been jailed for 10 days. Once released, he huddled with his advisor, trying to find a new strategy. What followed was the most controversial decision of King's leadership. On May 3rd, King asked the children of Birmingham to join the protest, risk joining their parents in jail, risk the wrath of Bull Connor's men.
You could count on him to do the exact wrong thing at the exact right time. And the movement counted on this, played on this. And there's a moment in the beginning of the movement where, for the first time, he hauls out those dogs and hoses, and Y.T. Walker, standing on the sidelines, jumps up and down with joy. We've got him now, he says.
The impact of television was profound. The images of that day shocked the nation and were broadcast around the world. John Kennedy told his staff they made him sick. Nonetheless, it was 8 months after the violence of Ole Miss and 2 years after the Freedom Rides that Kennedy finally decided to push for a civil rights bill. He spoke to the nation on the evening of June 11th, 1963.
We face, therefore, a moral crisis as a country and a people. It cannot be met by repressive police action. It cannot be left to increase demonstrations in the streets. It cannot be quieted by token moves or talk. It is a time to act in the Congress, in your state and local legislative body, and above all, in all of our daily lives.
That's the first time an American president said that morally black people in this country were right and their cause prevailed. That was not said in the Emancipation Proclamation. It set them free. Kennedy got on the side of what the blacks were seeking.
Movement leaders welcomed Kennedy's address, but still feared the bill would not survive Southern filibusters that were sure to come. They asked for a meeting with Kennedy to press for increased action. A. Philip Randolph, the most senior leader present, wanted Kennedy to support a march on Washington.
In that meeting on that Saturday morning, meeting with President Kennedy, that Mr. Randolph spoke up and said, "Mr. President," in his baritone voice, "Mr. President, the black masses are restless, and we're going to march on Washington." You could tell at that moment by the very body language of President Kennedy, he didn't like what he heard. He started moving and shifting in his chair. And he said to Mr. Randolph, "If you bring all these people to Washington, we will never get a civil rights bill passed. Won't there be disorder violence and chaos. And Mr. Randolph responded and said, Mr. President, this will be an orderly, peaceful, non-violent protest.
Kennedy reluctantly endorsed the march, but on his terms. Bobby Kennedy and his staff would scrutinize every detail. If the marchers intended to come to Washington, they were going to have to follow a script dictated by the Kennedy brothers. That included advanced review of the speeches. And Bobby Kennedy reserved the right to censor any hint of criticism of the White House. On August 28, 1963, 200,000 came to the grounds of the Washington Monument to speak with one voice on the need for equal rights for all. The March on Washington became a moment to invoke the dream of a colorblind society.
With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day.
At the time of Kennedy's assassination, the proposed Civil Rights Bill was floundering and heading toward almost certain defeat. It would be his successor, Lyndon Johnson, who would invoke Kennedy's legacy and prod a reluctant Congress to act. By his third year in office, Kennedy had established a bond with the American people through television. He was the first president to host live televised press conferences and quickly mastered the format. He held 64 during his presidency, an average of one every 2 weeks.
The end of this summer of 1963 will be an especially critical time for 400,000.
As many as 65 million Americans watched each one. They saw a man who was not only knowledgeable, but quick on his feet and quick-witted.
Supporters of your trade expansion bill feel that you have misjudged the implications of your decision to raise the carpet and glass tariffs. There have been 7 cases by the Tariff Commission which have come to my desk as president. In the case of 3 of them, I believe, they were by a split decision. 4 of them were unanimous, 2 were accepted by me, and 2 were rejected. Now, in this case...
Underneath it all was this really almost quasi-intellectual approach in which he knew, he read history, he read biography, he read events. Then he had humor. Let me tell you, humor takes you just a long, long way in this world.
His use of spontaneous humor endeared him to the viewers. One example came in November of 1961. While giving a press conference, he received word that the U.S. had successfully launched a chimpanzee into space.
I guess this chimpanzee who was flying in space took off at 10:08. He reports that everything is perfect and working well.
He liked those press conferences, and he knew he was good at it. Time and time again, you could see his mind working. You could see, while the question was being asked, you could see, I thought I could see in him formulating the answer, and then when he got it right, he'd smile.
Excuse me, Miss Montgomery.
Mr. President, I wonder if you could tell us whether, if you had it to do over again, you would work for the presidency, and whether you can recommend the job to others.
Well, the answer is, the first is yes, and the second is no. I don't recommend it to others, at least for a while.
Mr. President, the Democratic platform in which you ran for election promises to work for equal rights for women, including equal pay. What have you done for the women according to the promises of the platform?
Well, I'm sure we haven't done enough, and I must say I am a strong believer in equal pay for equal work, and I think that we ought to do better than we're doing, and I'm glad that you reminded me of it, Mr. President.
2.5 years into his presidency, a stronger, more confident political leader was emerging. There were real accomplishments. He'd set up the Peace Corps, increased funding for education, the arts, the environment, and mental health.
So in many ways, his thinking, he's growing, he's evolving, he's becoming a different person, a different politician. In many ways, his relationship with Jacqueline is improving.
That relationship had its tough moments. We do know President Kennedy had affairs. We don't know how they affected his marriage. But for many, the Kennedys epitomized the American dream, and President Kennedy knew how to capitalize on this. Despite Jackie having ordered the White House staff to keep uninvited press away from the children, the president disobeyed. Some of the best-known family photographs came at Jack's behest. He had an uncanny eye for a good photo op. He would call in the kids and the cameras when Jackie wasn't around. One of those cameras belonged to White House photographer Cecil Stoughton. One morning, while Jackie was away, he shot a dozen photos and had them ready by the afternoon for the president to look at.
He said, "What have you got, Captain?" And I said, "Well, I got the pictures I made this morning." He said, "Bring them in." So I brought them in. I stood behind his desk while he riffled through these 12 prints. And when he came to the famous one of the two children with their feet just gently touching the rug, and he's sitting there clapping, he was excited about it, and he called Pierre Salinger on his intercom and said, "Pierre, come in, I've got something for you."
Kennedy had Press Secretary Pierre Salinger release it to the media. The next day, the picture was in newspapers across the country. That summer, Stoughton joined the First Family for weekends at the Squaw Island retreat they rented near Hyannisport. There, he shot home movies, directed by Jackie. They were not released publicly until years after John Kennedy's death.
Well, I would be invited to go to all of those events and put it on film for her perusal. She didn't like silent films. I'd put some appropriate music with it, and the following weekend I'd take a projector and a screen into their living room at Squaw Island and show them the film of last week. So they didn't have to go downtown to the Bijou and see a Saturday night movie. They'd have their own in their living room. There were occasions where I would be the only one in the room with them, showing them the films at night in Hyannis after the weekend. They'd go up the stairs hand in hand, saying, "You can let yourself out, Captain."
The summer of 1963 seemed an idyllic time on the Cape. They were getting ready for a new baby, and Kennedy's health was improving. It was the best it had been since he was a teenager.
He was on fewer pain medications, and he was healthier, more vigorous.
That may have come about in part because Dr. Janet Travell's role in treating the president was diminished. Admiral Berkeley had insisted Dr. Travell stop treating the president's back ailments. By June 1963, Travell could no longer order medical services for the president without Berkeley's approval. She was kept on as White House physician, however, perhaps because of a concern that if fired, she would reveal Kennedy's medical secrets. As well as Kennedy seemed to be doing that summer, there were signs of danger looming. None of Kennedy's doctors knew at the time that some of the medications he was taking were putting his long-term health at risk.
The testosterone and all the other medications he was taking apparently drove up his cholesterol. We found that he had a cholesterol of 410. Acceptable cholesterol these days is seen as no more than 200. It probably would have done him in by the time he was in his 50s.
And political pitfalls remained, some that tested Kennedy's typically calm demeanor. Like the story he read in the Washington Post that summer. It disclosed that over $5,000 had been spent by the Air Force preparing a suite of rooms at the Air Force Hospital where Jackie was going to give birth. Kennedy called the Air Force press officer who had the misfortune to be on duty.
See the Post this morning? Yes, sir. I'm looking. See that fellow's picture by the bed? Yes, sir. And you see that furniture they bought from Jordan Marsh? What the hell do they let the reporters in there for? Are they crazy up there? Now you know what's going to do. Any congressman's going to get up and say, Christ, if they can throw $5,000 away on this, let's cut them another $1 billion. You just sank the Air Force budget. You're crazy up there. Are they crazy? That silly bastard with his picture next to the bed? I'm appalled, but... Well, I'm appalled, too. All right, sir. Then I want that fella's incompetent who had his picture taken next to Mrs. Kennedy's bed, if that's what it is. I mean, he's a silly bastard. I wouldn't have him running a cat house. You better look into it, and especially when you told me that they hadn't spent a cent. Why, sir, this is obviously... Well, this is obviously a fuck-up, sir.
An annoyance, but there was worse to come. However happy it seemed, that summer of 1963 also was one of personal tragedy and political risk. On August 7th, the Kennedys' son Patrick was born with a serious lung ailment and died 2 days later. In the aftermath of their son's death, some noticed a bond between husband and wife that had often seemed to be missing before.
But I remember after Patrick Bouvier died, in August of 1963, and we had to go up to Hyannisport. And I saw them look at each other. And without putting more into it than probably it deserves, I saw them look at each other as married people often do, with a great sense of loss, and at the same time, a great sense of understanding.
Kennedy told Red Fay that of all the women he'd known, Jackie was the only one he would ever have considered marrying. Yet that didn't stop his apparent drive for sexual conquest, regardless of the risk or moral compromises. In early July, J. Edgar Hoover asked Bobby Kennedy to come to his office at the FBI. Hoover claimed he'd unearthed a spy ring that had been working for Walter Ulbricht, the East German leader. A woman, Ellen Romisch, now in America, was believed to have jeopardized national security at the very highest levels of government.
Hoover was always trolling for sticks to hit the Kennedys with, and here was a wonderful opportunity. He gets a report that a woman who's alleged to be an East German spy, a call girl, running with the Bobby Baker crowd, a LBJ lobbyist, is performing sexual favors for the President of the United States. What could be better for J. Edgar Hoover? And so he sends one of these bland memos over to RFK to put him on notice, and it rings a big alarm bell in the Kennedy administration. In fact, they get the woman and they kick her out of the country.
Ellen Romisch was deported just days before a congressional investigation intended to subpoena her. Kennedy had been lucky. He assumed he could hide his behavior behind reporting standards of the day. But by the fall of 1963, the rumors were growing louder, and his ability to contain the scandals was diminishing.
My hunch is that had there been no Dallas, he would have been reelected, but that this sort of thing would have broken wide open sometime in his second term, if not before, and he might have been forced out of office. I think there's a very good chance of that. Kennedy had a sense of honor, and had there been it been established that he had hurt the country, the office, his family, I think he'd resign.
That view is not shared by others who knew Jack Kennedy. They remain convinced that even if he'd served 2 full terms, he would have been able to continue concealing his dalliances. Whatever his personal flaws, he was, that last summer of his life, poised to pass an arms control agreement that would bring the world a first step back from the nuclear abyss. In the summer of 1963, Kennedy was to visit the Pacific Fleet off the coast of San Diego. By drawing attention to the readiness of America's nuclear deterrent, he hoped to convince the country to reverse the arms race. On his way back to Washington, the president visited NORAD's early warning center built deep beneath Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado. He told his staff it was time to rethink Cold War attitudes. Conventional thinking had brought both sides to the point of annihilation. Whatever their differences, both Moscow and Washington shared the common desire to survive. Kennedy used a commencement address at American University to outline a new doctrine.
What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time.
To secure the peace, Kennedy wanted to negotiate an atmospheric nuclear test ban with the Soviets. He hoped it would stop other countries from developing their own weapons. Now Kennedy had to bring the European allies along, convince them that they didn't need to test nuclear weapons of their own because the Americans would honor their security guarantee. Kennedy broke with established diplomatic strategy. He bypassed de Gaulle and flew straight to Germany, where he met its chancellor, Konrad Adenauer. But the point of the trip was to deliver a promise directly to the people most in danger, the citizens of West Berlin.
I think he had this extraordinary respect for the people of Berlin and the struggle that they had made. He admired this personal courage of people, and he saw in them this extraordinary kind of resoluteness and strength at a time when any day they could have been sort of overwhelmed. And this sort of pluckiness had a lot of appeal to him, and he noted it and valued it and was inspired by it.
He went to the Berlin Wall to stare into the face of a regime he'd once been convinced would drag the world into nuclear war. Then a short trip to the City Hall, where over 1 million West Berliners greeted the president with chants of Kennedy, Kennedy. On June 26th, they heard a speech that would become one of the seminal moments of the entire Cold War.
There are many people in the world who really don't understand, or say they don't, what is the great issue between the free world and the communist world. Let them come to Berlin. There are some who say that communism is the wave of the future. Let them come to Berlin. And there are even a few who say that it's true that communism is an evil system, but it permits us to make economic progress. Lass sie nach Berlin kommen. Let them come to Berlin. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
Kennedy had brought them through very dangerous times, and in that moment he seemed in communion with the citizens of Berlin.
Based on an incredible correspondence of feelings, reliability, trust, confidence on both sides, he left his cards. He was also himself emotionalized, and he answered what the audience expected from him.
Kennedy remarked as he left, "We will never see another day like this one so long as we live." He then flew to Dublin. His staff had seen no point in adding Ireland to the itinerary, but for Jack Kennedy, the 2 days there would be a sentimental distraction from the burning issues at hand, a chance to relax among friends. The largest crowds in Irish history gathered to claim kin. Kennedy visited the spot where his great-grandfather, Patrick Kennedy, had left Ireland during the potato famine of 1848. As he left from Shannon Airport, he recited a poem from Ireland's past he felt described the present.
Last night somebody sang a song which says the words of which I'm sure you know, which come back to Erin, the land of thy birth. Come with the shamrock in the springtime. This is not the land of my birth, but it's the land for which I hold the greatest affection. And I certainly will come back in the springtime. Thank you. And I'm taking, as I go back to America, all of you with me. Thank you.
The European trip was both the emotional high point of the Kennedy years and also produced almost immediate results. After just 10 days of negotiations, the outline of a test ban treaty were ready to be signed in Moscow.
Yesterday, a shaft of light cut into the darkness. Let us make the most of this opportunity and every opportunity to reduce tension, to slow down the perilous nuclear arms race, and to check the world's slide towards final annihilation.
On September 24, 1963, the Atmospheric Test Ban Treaty passed the Senate by an overwhelming vote of 80 to 19. The treaty raised the possibility of détente and was the first significant arms control agreement reached between the United States and the Soviet Union. On the strategic level, Kennedy was moving toward an accommodation with the Soviet Union. On the tactical level, he was floundering. Khrushchev's support for local wars of liberation had always concerned Kennedy. The administration was convinced the Soviets were looking for weak spots to exploit. The concerns focused on Vietnam.
They would use Vietnam as a platform from which to put pressure, political pressure, military pressure, on other nations in the area. And the dominoes in his term would fall. It was thought by Eisenhower, it was thought by Kennedy, it was thought by me to be an episode in the Cold War, and that the security of the West would weaken if we lost Indochina.
By the fall of 1963, communist forces seemed poised for victory in Indochina. Kennedy blamed the South Vietnamese president Ngo Dinh Diem, who had used precious resources to suppress Vietnam's Buddhist majority rather than take the offensive against the communists. On the evening of November 1st, 1963, word of a coup in Saigon reached the White House. Kennedy activated his recording equipment.
There began with an attack against the Special Forces headquarters. They then began a process of demanding that the palace surrender. They have been moving troops in ever since. There have been several firefights occurred in the area around the palace.
Kennedy was listening to reports from McGeorge Bundy. In Saigon, the generals had moved against Diem. Over the next few days, Kennedy's options in Vietnam would dramatically diminish. 24 hours into the uprising, Diem was dead.
We could have stopped that coup, I think, had we acted firmly. We didn't. So part of the responsibility for the coup, in a sense, rested on the U.S. Certainly, Kennedy never intended that any actions or failure of action by him would result in the death of President Diem. I was with him when he received the news. He blanched. I've never seen him more distressed.
3 months earlier, he'd sent word to the South Vietnamese military that Washington would not be averse to a change in leadership. In light of Diem's assassination, Kennedy felt America had to accept responsibility for the consequences. He recorded his evaluation for his memoirs.
Monday, November 4th, 1963. Over the weekend, the coup in Saigon took place. Culminated 3 months of conversation about a coup. I feel that we must bear a good deal of responsibility for it. I was shocked by the death of Diem and Ngo. The way he was killed made it particularly abhorrent.
For 3 years, Vietnam had been simmering on Washington's back burner. Kennedy had increased the number of advisors from 900 to 16,500, but repeatedly insisted that combat troops were not needed and would not be sent. In October 1963, Kennedy had announced a preliminary withdrawal of 1,000 men by the middle of 1964. But it's clear, had he survived, he would have been confronted with the same choice that destroyed Lyndon Johnson: to escalate the fight with American troops or accept a communist victory.
The institutional restraints on JFK would have so limited his options that he would have had to commit American prestige and American arms to Vietnam. Whether he would have done it in the same way as Lyndon Johnson, I think, is open to question. But there is no doubt that America was going to face a very difficult, painful, and bloody conflict in Vietnam, whether Kennedy had lived or not.
Kennedy knew that in his second term he would have to confront the ambiguity of his Vietnam policy. He just hoped it could wait until after the election, or at least until he'd returned from a campaign trip that he would take to Dallas, Texas. With just a year to go before the 1964 presidential election, polls indicated that Kennedy would win decisively. However, he knew his civil rights stand had cost him in the South. A November trip to Texas would show that the president was not afraid to confront his critics. On the morning of November 22nd, Kennedy left Fort Worth, bound for a lunchtime speech in Dallas. Jackie hated campaigning. but had told Letitia Baldridge that this was one trip she was actually looking forward to making.
Jackie called me and said, I'm going to be a good political wife. Can you believe it? I'm going with Jack on this campaign trip, and I'm going to love it. I'm going to love doing it.
Wildly enthusiastic crowds lined the procession route. Kennedy had ordered the limousine's bubble top taken down so people could see him. Thousands had turned out. The governor's wife turned to the president and told him no one would ever be able to say you aren't loved in Dallas. The car turned from Main Street into Dealey Plaza, passing in front of the book depository building and into history.
And then what I did see was the grassy knoll with the people on it. It just like a big wind had swept over it. They were all on the ground, lying down. And I remember seeing a young man at the curbside, kind of alone, right down there, with his arm over his little boy, and he was pounding the ground.
The first bullet passed through Kennedy's neck but was not fatal. Lee Harvey Oswald had time to reload and take his second decisive shot at the president.
In Dallas, on his last day, he was wearing a brace, and it prevented him from falling over at the first shot. And his being kept upright in the car was what let the second shot kill him. And it's really tragic that the brace to keep him out of pain contributed to his death.
The scene at Parkland Memorial Hospital illustrated America's confusion, anger, and grief.
Hello, I've got some dictation for you on the Kennedy story. President John F. Kennedy was shot and killed here today, period. Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in at 2:39 p.m. Central Standard Time as the 36th President of the United States.
Information came so fast it could hardly be absorbed. The enormity of it all, the realization that in a single moment the dreams of the new frontier were gone. The drumbeat sounded across the nation's capital. A riderless horse accompanied the caisson in salute to a fallen hero. Thousands stood for hours to pay their respects. It was in part a response to shock, but the attachment to Kennedy went deeper. It was a reflection of a profound sense of personal loss. It was a loss felt beyond America's shores, among friend and foe alike.
When we got the news that he is dead, it was, in the first moment, unbelievable. And I think this is one of the few dates you cannot forget in your life. Where have you been when the wall came up, when the wall came down, when Kennedy was in Berlin, when Kennedy was dead? You can never forget. Berliners put lights in their windows, which is a signal of personal mourning. It was as a part of our own existence in Berlin, would have been murdered.
Nikita Khrushchev went to the American embassy to sign the book of condolence, and then sent Anastas Mikoyan, his closest advisor, to represent the Soviet people at the funeral.
She was there, she was standing there in that black dress, and with, I think still with the veil. And as Mr. Mikoyan came abreast of her, she took his hand, outstretched hand, into both of her hands. And this I remember as if it were yesterday. I still have a tingling feeling even today, because I can see it as it happened. And she said, Mr. Mikoyan, thank you for coming. And would you tell Mr. Khrushchev from me that my husband and Mr. Khrushchev could have brought peace to this world by working together. Now
Mr. Khrushchev will have to do it alone. Those were her words.
White House photographer Stoughton remembers covering the procession as the coffin left the White House.
I'm up on the steps when they carry the casket by, and I could reach out and touch the flag as it went by. And it was at that point and at that proximity that I finally laid my camera down and managed to sob a little bit.
This was the moment that reduced Stoughton to tears, John's farewell to his father. Amazingly, Stoughton recognized the salute, knew that he'd seen it before. He reviewed the footage of the family's last weekend together. There it was, the moment Jackie taught her son to salute his father, the Commander-in-Chief.
Jackie was teaching him how to salute, and I made movies of that when he marched up and stood in front of her and saluted with his left hand, and then she made him change to the right. So he learned to salute under my camera.
It's been images like these, recorded that last weekend at the family's home in Middleburg, Virginia, that have helped shape our view of the final days of Kennedy's life.
He's frozen in our memories at the age of 46. So handsome, so articulate, so witty, so charming, so charismatic. He was a man of exceptional promise.
Frozen at 46 means that we will never know whether his personal and physical weaknesses would have eclipsed his political achievements, but he shaped the times through which he passed. Nowhere has the world seen a more vivid transformation than along the Berlin Wall, the division between the communist and free worlds that brought mankind to the brink of destruction. Kennedy is still remembered today as the American politician who stood with West Berliners to protect their security during the city's darkest hour. Forgotten is his perceived indifference to the building of the wall, his acceptance that the citizens of Berlin should remain divided so long as it avoided a wider war. He is still the only man who can draw thousands to Berlin's City Hall to simply listen to a recording of his voice, heard here in June 1963.
Freedom is indivisible, and when one man is enslaved, all are not free. When all are free, then we can look forward to that day when this city will be joined as one, and this country, and this great continent of Europe, in a peaceful and hopeful globe. When that day finally comes, as it will, the people of West Berlin can take sober satisfaction in the fact that they were in the front lines for almost 2 decades.
The Freedom Bell, a gift from America to the city of Berlin, rings out across John F. Kennedy Platz. Kennedy's words replayed in a united city at the heart of a unified and democratic Germany. For many of his own countrymen, Kennedy remains an enigma. The passage of the years has revealed weaknesses of character and destroyed the illusion of vitality. Yet his enduring appeal seems to transcend personal frailty, in part perhaps because he spoke of an America of tolerance, prospering in a world free from fear.
Kennedy, in spite of his slowness to act, to move, had created and ushered in a period of great expectation. We expected more, and we demanded a great deal of him because we expected more.
All of the people who served him, all of whom had separate relations with him, had their lives enhanced by touching this magic prince. He controlled people and commanded people with his personal charm. They wanted to be with him. They did what he wanted because they wanted to be with him, because life was brighter and airier when John Kennedy was around them.
He was not a perfect human being. Who among us is? He made mistakes in his private life and his public life. But had he lived, the world would be a different world today. And it would be a very, very much better world.
I think he inspired really a whole generation of men and women to be involved in public life. And I think we deep down have the admiration and respect for those political leaders, whoever they are, you know, that challenge us and appeal to our more hopeful side.
Kennedy occupied the presidency for just 1,000 days. It was not Camelot, but it was a time when a president laid out a vision, not of what we were, but of what we might become.